It's a real question out there, which is why is there a threefold excess of multiple myeloma in people of African origin? And so we thought we'd try and address that problem in a really meaningful way, because black people have tended not to be sequenced, they haven't had their genome sequenced, and so there's very little information about the African genome. And so we put together a series of many hundreds of cases and did whole genome sequencing, and did a group of people of European origin and African Americans. And the clever thing was that rather than asking the people what their racial origin was, we used a DNA-based tool to infer not only their amount of African origin, but the admixture with other races, so as we could really kind of focus in on what was causing these abnormalities. And in the past, it was thought that there was an excess of a group called the 1114. And what we found was that the translocations and all of the general genomic features of multiple myeloma were more or less exactly the same across the two racial ancestry groups. But what we did find was that the African genomes were actually less complicated than the European genomes, and they had less of a signature called a mutational signature called APOBEC. And this is a really novel finding. So not only are there differences in the risk of developing myeloma in people of African origin, but they also are less genomically complicated. So there is real differences. And the outstanding question is whether that's inherited through the genome, or it reflects a social construct of sort of structural racism. And so we looked at a number of inherited variants to see if we could see a difference. Broadly, again, we didn't find any genetic explanation for the differences. So what we found basically is less complex genomes in people of African origin. There doesn't seem to be much impact of the amount of admixture, but there was very little difference between the genomes of whites and blacks. And so what we're pursuing now is that there's some kind of structural racism about the lived environment where you live and the stresses you get from the environment. And so we're pursuing those ideas further to ask, are there differences in people's germinal center reaction and the signatures they have in their normal memory B cells dependent upon the environmental conditions where they live, such as postcode, which can allow you to access it. So I think it's very interesting, because most studies looking at outcome have shown that there are equal outcomes between Caucasian Americans and African Americans. And yet, as they have a less complex genome, you might expect that given equal access, they'd have better outcomes. And so I think that's, a really interesting point to follow up on, and tells you about why African Americans, people of African origin outside America, should be recruited into clinical trials, so as we get more data and more information.